Everyone, welcome back to the Earthdawn Survival Guide, a podcast for all disciplines, paths, players, and game masters. I am Dan. My co-host is, of course, Josh.
Hello, everybody.
And on today's podcast, we will be discussing all things astronomical and metaphysical. Because today is mostly about Astral Sight. I'm a corny pun meister. What do you want from me? Josh is over here shaking his head and rolling his eyes at me. Just like my wife. If I don't get an eye roll daily, it's not the same relationship I'm used to. So anyway, if you have any further questions for us on anything we're going to talk about today, if we didn't cover anything today, please feel free to get a hold of us at edsgpodcast@gmail.com, or you can find us on the Twitters and the Facebook Earthdawn Guild and so forth and so on. So
yes,
how about we just kind of jump right in, because we have we actually asked for questions and got some questions.
We got questions, and hope you got questions. Hopefully we got answers.
We got pages of questions.
We got pages.
Yeah, these are long. So
hey, this is great. If
people wants to know.
Yeah. So, well, it is an interesting subject.
It's an esoteric type subject that since we have to put it in game mechanics on occasion or explain a couple of things. So it is. We started something and we said, hold that thought. We're going to talk about it on the air, or at least record it. I did see a question today on the Earthdawn Guild. Why is there no astral smell? Why is there no astral taste? Why is there no astral, astral feeling, something like that. So did you want to gloss over that or kind of just
I think we'll just leave a pin stuck in that for now and come back to it.
We'll try and come back to that one.
We'll try and come back to it.
First question, or first batch of questions, because Dustin went in depth, so we're going to handle these as much as possible. So I'll kind of give Josh a high sign here since he can see me. This is from Dustin. Hi guys, how does astral sensing function in regard to astral forms? The text of the Earthdawn 4 Player's Guide is fairly explicit about perceiving the astral imprints of physical forms, but not nearly as clear on what astral sensing reveals of astral natives. Below are the key questions as I see them. To be clear, question 1 refers to direct perception of astral space, i.e. via trip into astral space itself, only in case there is a meaningful distinction to be made between direct perception and astral sensing. The remaining questions refer to astral sensing as 4th edition defines it, the usual filtered apprehension enabled by magical abilities such as Astral Sight and Thread Sight, blah, blah, blah. None of the mentions of astral sensing should be read as references to the specific astral sensing spell that's led to so many debates in the past. Thank you, Dustin, for making those clear distinctions. We're going to try not to get too much into the weeds, but this whole podcast today is about getting into more weeds.
This is where we've got the pith helmets and the machetes out. We are blazing a trail.
Absolutely. So question number 1, direct perception of astral space. A character directly perceiving astral space sees the astral imprint of all physical things and astral creatures and any other astral patterns, quoting page 205. Does this mean the character sees native astral forms as imprints as well, or in fully resolved detail similar to the way he'd see a physical object with normal vision? If native astral forms also appear as imprints, is there any way the Namegiver can view astral form itself the way he views physical forms with his eyes?
Okay, so...
yeah.
Trying to think of
I'm going to get out of the way and let Josh lead, so I'm just here to ask questions.
Again, talking about direct astral perception, which is to say someone who has gone through a spirit portal, I think is the name of the power, or using the Netherwalk talent or something like that, where they are actually entered astral space.
Inhabiting the astral plane.
They are actually in the astral plane. They would see native residents, native inhabitants, anything that is there astrally in however it appears in astral space. Personally, I would say that at that point, it's as if you are in the same space as they are.
Yeah.
And so there's no longer, if there's a spirit there, you would see the spirit. You would, at that point, assuming that the spirit is not manifest, there is no real, there is, but its form and its imprint are one and the same, in the same way that when you enter astral space, your physical body and your astral imprint, your astral form, merge and just form one thing, there's no real distinction between the spirit's astral presence, the spirit itself, and its imprint. So, you know, at that point, when you start getting into actually being in astral space, the questions about astral sensing and what do you see with various results and all that sort of thing kind of go away.
Yeah.
In a sense, at that point, I would start relying on just regular perception and perhaps having the relative level of astral pollution act as a modifier to the difficulty for perception tests, as this in a similar way that like light levels like darkness, total darkness, partial darkness, or whatever affect normal regular perception vision tests in the regular world. That's kind of how I would handle it. I admittedly, because they tend to be high circle powers.
Yeah.
Aside from being able to summon a spirit that has the ability to open a portal that allows you to cross into the astral, which I've not really had a lot of direct experience with. You know, when you start getting into the astral, like when you start getting with, we are physically going into the astral plane, things can get a little bit weird. But yeah, I would say that if someone is actually entering the astral plane, they would see the spirit or the horror or whatever other astral entities are there in whatever form they take.
Yeah.
Or whatever form they have in astral space, which might not necessarily, if you're talking about dual-natured horrors or something like that, reflect their physical counterpart.
Okay. Fair enough.
I think that answers the question.
I think so too.
Okay.
Question number 2. Does the same answer apply if the character is using an astral sensing ability, i.e. Astral Sight? Like
yes.
Windling's Astral Sight.
If someone is using Astral Sight, the Astral Sight talent, or whether they have it as a Windling racial ability or whatever, and they succeed, I am of the opinion that if they succeed on their test to actually successfully perceive astral space in the first place, that is being the difficulty 6+ modifiers, they would actually be able to at least see the imprint of an astral entity that is there. Yeah. So a spirit, a horror, whatever, I think they would be able to at least see that there is something there, and they would recognize that it is not reflected of something that has a physical counterpart in the regular world.
In the corporeal, yeah. So
now, it just means that they recognize that something is there. They don't automatically know necessarily what it is. Or because at that point, because at that point, that initial test, all they're seeing is the imprint. They're seeing that there is something present there. And I think this is probably where we will segue into the astral smell question.
Fair. Okay. Pin untaken.
Pull the pin out. The way that I have generally thought about it is that Astral Sight and the various slightly different flavors of astral perception that exist in Earthdawn, whether you're talking about earlier editions where there were like 2 or 3 different ways that they worked as opposed to the more unified mechanic that we have now, or in 4th edition, you know, where you've got Astral Sight and Life Sight and a couple of other things. What is happening is that magical ability is taking information about magical energy, the astral energy that surrounds us, that surrounds the characters in the world and is not normally perceptible. Okay. And translates that through the magic into stimuli that the Namegiver is able to interpret and understand. It's called Astral Sight because we are mainly heavily visual creatures and tend to think about everything in terms of how things look and vision and colors and designs and things like that.
A third of the human brain is to process visual input.
Right.
That's pretty dependent
But there
upon
is
eyes.
absolutely nothing at all, I feel, that would prevent astral information, the information that is being conveyed to the character through the use of Astral Sight, to perhaps be presented in other sensations. That maybe when they are examining, say, the pattern of a cursed item, right, that they've rolled high enough, they're able to maybe, like, they're examining the pattern, that maybe some aspects of that convey some of that information as having like a bitter taste or an oily feeling or something along those lines.
Or a vibration.
Yeah, of conveying that stuff that goes along with that in terms of other senses. And again, it's not strictly speaking taste or smell or touch or sound. It's just how the magic is interpreting that information in a way to convey to the Namegiver that's using it.
Yeah.
Because, and I've always felt that it is possible for someone who is blind, who doesn't have use of their sight, to be able to use Astral Sight as a way of being able to see, quote unquote, to be able to perceive the world around them and be able to navigate and interact with the world in that way. There's a couple of examples in past fiction and so forth of characters that are able to do that. And so I think that's perfectly fine. Again, sight being super important, but the magic basically presenting the information in ways that might... It also allows you as a GM perhaps to be a little bit more creative and to engage other senses, which is something that's often encouraged when you are describing a scene or trying to convey information to your players, of engaging more than just sight, but trying to interact with other senses as well and see how they... Because while we are very strongly associated sight-based, smell has a very strong memory component to it.
Oh, well, the
memories are really strongly triggered by smells.
Yes.
And, various other things like that. And even getting into more esoteric senses like sense of balance or whatnot, maybe examining some kind of pattern could do weird things to your sense of space or proximity or
your position within
perspective or
space.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. No,
I feel like the question was sort of asked as part of a joke, but I think it actually opens an avenue to a good
using it in a specific way.
To using it in a creative and maybe slightly different way.
One of my friends many years ago made a human with versatility and decided to make his character blind, and so picked up Astral Sight as a first circle talent. And so he relied on that. And yes, he had to pay the strain every time he used it. So he went around mostly blind until it came to combat. And that was one of those, okay, now I can turn on my Astral Sight.
Oh, yeah.
Like strain, and now I can see my opponents.
If anybody has seen Rogue One, the blind character in Rogue One, if you've not...
Chirrut Imwe. Yes.
The Force... I am one of the Force faith, the Faith Force user guy. He's not a Jedi, but... Yeah, but that's that kind of situation.
Totally. So, and actually this character was made before that movie came out, but yes, same kind of thing. But yeah, so the game master running that campaign, because I was a player in that one, really had to think about, okay, how do I engage his other senses? What do things feel like? What do things smell like? What temperature is it? And so he really had to think outside his usual box of game master presentation, because he had a character who was visually impaired until it came to Astral, and he would only turn that on every once in a while because it, cost strain. So that does happen. Dustin has more questions. Dustin,
yes.
Question 3. Since an initial view of the astral imprints of physical forms reveals an impression of the strength and location of said form's patterns, what information does the astral sensing of an astral form or imprint, as clarified by answers to previous questions, reveal about that form or imprint's pattern? Can the pattern of an astral form or imprint be studied in the same manner as the pattern of the astral imprint of a physical form? He thought long and hard about these questions.
Yes. I had to run back through that question again just to make sure that okay. Yeah. So the initial sensing test, that initial Astral Sight roll that you make.
Yes.
That determines whether you actually successfully perceive astral space or not. All that really does is lets you notice and be aware of the imprints that are around you and whether those imprints are magically alive or not.
Yeah.
Okay. So that you can tell, oh, that's a rock, that's a chair, that's a living pattern. You could look at a regular, a mundane sword and a thread sword that were sitting next to each other on the table, even if they are physically, in the regular world, identical.
Yeah.
If you look at them astrally, one of them would have a solid, magically active imprint.
Yes.
Whereas the other one would be the more hazy, it would still be there, the imprint would still be there, but it is clearly a non-living imprint. So that initial sensing test doesn't tell you anything except, is this thing, spirit, namegiver, object, whatever, is it magically alive? Magically active, for lack of a better term, although I'm not crazy about that phrasing.
I go with active as well because I couldn't find a better word, so we can stick with that.
But like a non-adept person is magically alive, even though they don't have magical abilities that they use.
Yeah.
That's why magically active feels a little bit. But anyway, so you could, if you looked astrally and you saw that there was an imprint in a place where there was no physical person present, and it was a spirit or a namegiver who had crossed over into astral space,
or a mouse,
or a horror, or whatever, you could see the imprint and you could tell that it is a magically active imprint. It would not tell you anything more than that, but then you could use your subsequent Astral Sight tests, or tests to further examine the pattern of that item going against its mystic defense to see if it is, to see what you could potentially learn.
Yeah.
And, generally speaking, anything that is solely active in astral space tends to have a higher mystic defense, and so it can sometimes be tough to learn things about them. So you can't just by flipping to astral space tell whether something is a spirit or a horror or whatever.
Yeah.
You would need to basically spend some time examining it.
Yeah, it's like tuning on the radio. You're getting static so you know that it works, and then you have to actually tune into the radio station you're looking to hear from, just visually.
So I think that addresses the question.
Yeah, because it was dealing with the initial view. So question 4, and this is like the second to last question he's got. So in the case of dual-natured horrors, what would astral sensing perceive if the astral form of an observed horror was not in range of the sensing ability, but the physical form was?
What do you want to have happen?
Fair.
I mean, when you start dealing with dual-natured horrors, yeah.
He's got a follow-up to that.
Basically, at that point, you're dealing with one entity that has two distinct bodies that do not necessarily need to be in physically the same location.
Yeah.
So you would still potentially be able to see the imprint of its physical form being there, and maybe be able to examine the pattern of its physical form. And if you rolled well enough, maybe sense that it's connected to something else that you can't see.
Yeah.
You'd probably be looking at really high difficulties to pull that off. But you might be able to learn some limited stuff about the physical form if you're exploring it.
Yeah.
If its secondary form, if its astral form is elsewhere, you might not even notice that it's there, or vice versa.
I kind of imagine that like a cartoon overlay. I can see the physical form in front of me, but if I flip astrally speaking, I can see its outline, like a cartoon drawing outline of what it actually is, kind of like its avatar, just superimposed over that.
Well, for a dual-natured horror, and again, when you start getting into horrors, you can break the rules however you want. That's kind of what horrors are intended to do.
Yeah.
But for a dual-natured horror, its physical form is still going to be magically alive. It's still going to be active. And so you could look at it and examine it just as if it were a normal, mundane, physical-only horror.
Yeah.
It's just you would probably need to roll really well against its mystic defense in order to sense that there was another part of it elsewhere. That's part of the reason why dual-natured horrors are so scary. Because you might think that you killed its physical form, but its other form is off elsewhere.
And
plotting revenge.
You're not going to have a lot of time because it's there to,
Look at Nebis from the original horrors book.
Yes.
His whole shtick is his physical form isn't super difficult. Like, it's not super tough. But he's a dual-natured horror, so he likes throwing his physical form against adepts, marking them in the course of, like, oh, hey, look, we killed the horror, and it marks them in the course of that, and then its astral form comes back and screws around with them and uses them to reform its physical body. I mean, Nebis, 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 Nebis. Nebus Nebus.
Is evil, evil, evil. Yes. So, okay. So his follow-up question, in other words, does a dual-natured horror have both an astral imprint of its physical form and an astral form present in astral space simultaneously?
Yes. Usually.
So he says, if yes, and there's the answer, how difficult is it to distinguish between the astral imprint and the astral form if they are in the same place?
It depends on the horror, the relative corruption of astral space, and whatever
certain
other
factors.
Stuff you want to deal with. The horror's physical presence has an imprint, has a pattern, has a living magical essence that can be examined. If the astral presence, the other nature of the horror, is also present within range, you could sense that it is there and not even necessarily physically superimposed over the physical form. It could be elsewhere, and you might just think, oh, there's a spirit or something like that is here as well. Maybe it's a minion of the horror, maybe blah, 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 blah. I think that you would at minimum need to beat the horror's mystic defense when examining the pattern in order to pick that up, and maybe even, and probably the horror might have powers that increase the difficulty to sense that connection, or any number of other funky things. So it is as difficult as you want it to be.
Fair enough. So he did ask an if no, and I'm not going to read that one since you did answer the question of yes. So we're going to just let that one go. So Dustin, thank you. He recognizes this is a set of questions that has quite a bit of nuance. So thank you for taking the time to work through them. Josh has done a great job in 4th edition of clarifying the astral generally, but this particular area seems still a little too murky. So he wanted to push. So especially in light of this edition's push to use more spirits. So thank you, Dustin, for all your questions. We hope that answers all of them and doesn't present any more. However, if you have more, get a hold of us.
I hope I answered the questions.
You did. You did a great job. You did a whole lot better than I could have. So this is why you're on the writing team. On to Kay Scott. Hey, guys. I heard you were planning an episode on astral space. Where'd you hear that? I'm looking forward to that, and I thought I would ask a question. How can one tell if a person, place, or thing is tainted or corrupted? I understand that simply perceiving astral space and therefore the astral imprint is not enough. Instead, could a player notice corruption by perceiving the astral pattern of something by beating its mystic defense? Or is there still more to be done, like extended study or a knowledge skill test like a horror lore? In other words, can a player make a one successful astral sight test on a wandering stranger and know whether or not to talk to the stranger or roll initiative?
To answer that last question first, no. It is not as simple as, oh, I roll astral sight and now I know. No, that's part of the insidious nature of the horrors. Part of the reason why they are so feared is that there really isn't any sure way. Quick. There's no easy sign that indicates whether a horror is, like, whether somebody is tainted or corrupted.
Yeah.
Generally speaking. And now we're going to talk about, I think, something separate from horror marks, which I think are kind of addressed directly under the horror mark rules in the GM's guide. Yeah. That to sense a horror mark, because those are really intended to be hidden, like requires beating the mystic defense of the horror and blah, blah, blah. But generally speaking, no, even if you beat the target's mystic defense, being able to sense corruption, especially if you're talking about things like corruption points, which were introduced with some horrors, I certainly don't think that it should be an easy thing to detect.
No,
I think you're looking at something that would require multiple successes against the target's mystic defense. And so at least some amount of extended astral study in order to pull that off.
And probably some real world observation of their behaviors as well.
Yeah, maybe.
Or other personality quirks, tics.
Maybe that as well. But it's just, it shouldn't be an easy thing.
No. Because some corrupted people hide out, I can't say in plain sight for a long period of time. But
right. I kind of want to say something like, well, if you are using corruption point mechanics, then you could look at their corruption point total in relation to whatever, when in the discussion of corruption points in the GM guide.
Yeah.
Like in terms of the relative whatever, and maybe have an inverse relation to the number of corruption points that they have compared to whatever the threshold is in your game for how nasty they are. And like the closer they are to that limit, the fewer successes are required. But yeah, any kind of cursed or tainted or corrupted stuff, it shouldn't be impossible, but it should be difficult. Like my gut says starting at minimum 3 successes and maybe requiring more depending on the nature of it and how subtle it's supposed to be.
Yep, that sounds
going back, spoilers here for Blades. The Blades of Carafad and the wonderful adventure anthology that is based around them. A big part of that revolves around the fact that the items are cursed and that the group doesn't really learn about the curse until they're already kind of bound to the item and discovering that it's causing them problems. Tainted, corrupted stuff like that should work along those lines.
Yeah.
Using Astral Sight as a kind of detect evil is not what's intended for. Yeah.
Yeah. Fair. Thank you, Kay Scott. That was at least I can't see a rudimentary question, but it's good to get that out in the open as well, just to satisfy that as a no. This is not a detect evil as they walk on by.
Yeah,
thing.
it should be tough.
Yeah, it's
you know how tough that is should be varies a little bit from table to table. I'm always like 3 successes. What would have in the older systems been an excellent success?
Yeah, I agree.
3 successes, 4, 5. You know, again, it depends on a whole bunch of finer details.
Mm-hmm. We got you. So on to Brian and his litany of half a page worth of questions here as well. So hi there from Brian. I know this is only tangentially related to Astral Sight. He's throwing like highfalutin words at us already. So we're in for a treat. But it seemed like a good moment to bring it up. The Life Sight talent works fairly similarly to Astral Sight, and in the descriptive text indicates it is in some way using the astral, but is of course limited to living things, which my game masters also felt could use some clarification on whether it includes, say, spirits or horrors or false men. We all agree it definitely won't detect undead. My main question actually relates specifically to the shaman spell Life Sense, which lasts for hours, and as far as we can tell, allows the caster to make a single life sight check that lasts the entire duration. Our main concern was in the fact that this means that you could, in theory, cast the spell, get a life sight test of, say, 43, ideally using other means to boost the roll, like spending karma and inspire others, and that almost nothing can hide from what amounts to ground-penetrating radar for most of the day, being an 8th circle spell. I think it's fairly reasonable to expect the shaman will have spellcasting of 8 or more by the time they gain access to the spell, and quite possibly higher, so 8 or more hours seems likely. Is that the way it was intended? While Josh is researching that, I'll keep talking. In the end, I think we settled on just having the user make a new life sense test when appropriate to try and detect creatures coming into the area, but I'm curious if the spell was written in a way that made the original intent unclear, because being able to use a single test result for hours at a time felt very unusual to us. We thought it made more sense that it was intended to work similar to the wizard spell Astral Sense, which seems to allow tests as appropriate.
So Life Sense is similar to the wizard spell Astral Sense, in that it is a spell that enhances the use of a talent.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, it
was actually kind of relevant, so we went over shamans just a little while ago.
So, those of you listening at home missed the several minutes of conversation where I called Morgan to get clarification on that question.
It's called editing.
Because I was pretty sure what the answer was, but Morgan wrote the spell, and I wanted to double check with him beforehand. To summarize the answer, yes, basically the Life Sense spell is supposed to work similarly to the Astral Sense spell for the wizard, which is to say they get that initial result that they might get when they initially cast the spell.
Okay.
And Morgan said if the GM wants to let it ride, that's okay. It might simplify things at the table and make things easier, but given the duration, obviously that could potentially cause problems. But it's supposed to be that if you are going into a new situation or a new encounter or things are changing, they should probably be making a new test each time. It's just that it covers an area effect and things like that.
Yeah. So not to make a new spell casting test each time to recast the spell.
Right. You just need to spell cast the spell once, and it'll more or less last you for most of the waking hours of the day. Yeah. But the life sense talent, because that's what you're actually rolling there, the spell itself doesn't determine the result of the life sense test. You need to be making a separate life sense test each time that the game master deems it appropriate.
Okay. Fair enough. So on to Brian's remaining questions. As another related question, can you use Astral Sight, Life Sight, separate from the spell while these spells are in operation? For example, you might want to see things further away than the spell-enhanced Astral Sight or Life Sight would allow. Presumably, if you can, you would have to take the strain, since it is the spell's enhancement that removes the strain cost on those talents.
Yeah, that's how I would probably handle that. Like the range on Life Sense is 30 yards.
Yeah.
So that you could use Life Sense on anything within 30 yards without paying a strain. But if you wanted, because of the range of your Life Sense talent, you wanted to potentially see something that was outside that range, then I would say, yeah, you would need to pay the strain. And that would be subject to the normal otherwise limitations. And I would say Astral Sight works the same way with regards to the Astral Sense spell for wizards. Yeah, that makes sense. I don't have a problem with that.
It's like squinting. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Lastly, from Brian, could you make a test again, either while using the above spells or while your initial Astral Sight talent is still in effect, on the condition that you know your initial test was poor? I'm not suggesting metagaming, but if your Astral Sight test can't get through basic astral corruption levels, or if you can't see your warrior friend who has a mystic defense of 10, your character might not know that you just rolled a 7 on a step 18, but they should at least be aware that their attempt to pierce the astral was not as successful as they might have wished.
Yeah. I appreciate the caveat in there of the I'm not suggesting metagaming.
Yeah.
But I understand, like, the intent is that the wizard would go, well, I should be able to
normally.
That gets into the thing of when you're doing that initial Astral Sight test, right? Where you're first trying to successfully perceive astral space. And at that point, the result of that test is either you perceive astral space and all of the imprints within range of your Astral Sight talent, or you don't. And you know if you don't, whether it's because you didn't overcome the increased difficulty of astral corruption, right? If it's a heavily corrupted area and you rolled an 8, but the adjustments due to astral corruption mean that you needed actually a 10 in order to succeed, you would have successfully perceived astral space, but all that you see around you is the astral pollution. And so you can't make out you can't see imprints, you can't see anything else, but you know, oh, this area is polluted. Like, that's the only information that you get from that. If you rolled less than a 6, all right, basically it didn't work at all in the first place.
Yeah. You didn't turn your radio on.
Right. And so, like, that initial test, you would see, if you rolled a 7, right, and your warrior friend has a mystic defense of 10, you would still see his astral imprint. You would still see his living astral imprint over there where he is. And you would know that it is him. Other than that, at least this is the way that I run it.
Yeah.
If you beat that initial target number to successfully perceive astral space, 6+ corruption modifier, if that succeeds, then you see the imprints of everything within range, regardless of what those things' mystic defense is.
Yeah.
That is greatly simplified from previous editions, where you could only see the imprints of stuff that you beat the mystic defenses of. Yeah. And so some things could be in blah, blah, blah. And you need to spend time, like, sensing the things that you know. On your initial test, if successful, you can see astral. You get all of that astral information of the basic imprints and whether they are living or non-living of everything within range. So you would tell, oh, that's Grok the warrior over there.
Yeah.
Even if you didn't roll high enough to examine his pattern and learn anything from it, that's fine. You probably don't want to study his pattern to learn anything about it. You're interested in looking at this sword or whatever. Yeah. Those would be subsequent Astral Sight tests. I have successfully perceived astral space. I now want to focus on this particular pattern and see what I can learn from it.
Yes.
A lot of the way there are a couple of things you can do with, and now we start getting into the general stuff. When I'm running Astral Space, when I'm running a game, when I'm thinking of Astral Space, there's two kind of general things that I like to do with that. One is to just generally set the mood and tone and kind of flavor of what astral space is in the area.
Yeah.
If you think of kind of like auras and moods and things like that, is this a battlefield where there was a recent like violent conflict? That's going to have a different flavor in astral space than a place that is like a healing house of Garland that has been sanctified and dedicated to her service for decades, right? That is a storytelling, a mood setting kind of thing, the same way that you would use the sounds and smells and regular sensing stuff to convey mood and tone and style and whatever that the player characters are interacting with.
Yeah.
So that's aspect one. And that is secondary. That is, from the way that I consider it, kind of irrelevant to the results of astral sensing, of astral sight. Assuming you succeed in perceiving astral space, I'll give you that for free, because that just helps enhance my story weaving, whatever. The other piece of astral sight is to deal with it as an investigation. Okay, I can perceive astral space. I am now going to use these magical senses to see what I can learn about this particular thing.
It's your investigative tool.
Right, as an investigative tool, as looking at a magic item, looking at a person, looking at whatever.
This is your magnifying glass for Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah. And so then taking some time and making additional and subsequent astral sight rolls to see if you can fine tune or focus that magical sense to glean information from that you're trying to learn about this particular thing. And that information, the information that is conveyed by that, should be the kind of information that might provide clues, might provide hints, might provide leads to investigate, but it's going to be a little bit different than the type of information that you would get from, say, what's the wizard talent that the CSI talent?
Evidence analysis.
Evidence analysis, right? Yes. Evidence analysis probably uses a type of astral sensing to maybe gain some of the information that it presents. But regular, raw, normal astral sight is not going to provide the same kind of information that evidence analysis is.
Oh, no.
Plain old astral sight is probably not going to provide the historical information, perhaps, that evidence analysis would, but it will show you kind of what's going on there. And maybe there's some emotional resonance or some bits of things that might lurk around that might provide some hints, but it's not going to provide that same kind of information. Life sight is going to provide a different sort of information than regular plain old astral sight is. In earlier editions, especially third, astral sight got a little bit overbalanced in terms of the information that it could provide.
Fair.
It's similar, like using astral sight in those kind of investigative situations is similar to the same kind of knowledge or perception tests that you would be using in other investigative avenues. And that is to say that if you have a character or you have characters with astral sight in your player character party, when you are working on your adventure frameworks, you need to decide, okay, if they decide to examine this thing astrally, what is the information that I'm going to convey? How difficult are the clues going to be? And do the same if you look at the Legends of Barsave adventures, where we will have 1 success, 2 success, 3 successes that you learn on knowledge tests or streetwise or other investigative things. Do that same kind of thing with astral sight, but try and couch it in terms of images and metaphors and different sensory things that might give hints or clues that they can follow up on. That's the way that I use astral sight and generally try and deal with astral sight in my games. And that is either the flavor and atmosphere, or they are specifically looking for certain kinds of information. How is astral sight going to convey that information to them?
So let me ask you this, because we're out of questions from the listeners. And so
I pulled up the email to read Morgan the question when we were on things. And there are actually 2 more emails that showed up today.
They just popped in.
Go ahead and ask your question, and we will pop to this.
So I was going to say, since we're talking generalities for astral space, I've run some games before, and I've had some players play their astral sensing characters and so forth. How do you describe what astral space looks like? Or how do you describe what an astral imprint looks like? Because I usually just go with, okay, they've hit astral space, poof, it's now like degrees of blue on blue. So dark blue is, extra dense, dead like rock, and light blue is, kind of man-made objects, maybe a little bit, just to differentiate 3D, three-dimensional space a little bit as astrally speaking. And then I kind of say, well, my astral imprints it's a kind of a set of glowing lights, and there's an outline. So if you take a look at the Silver Surfer drawings from Ron Lim back in the 80s and 90s, how there's these little tiny light reflections that hit off the Silver Surfer's skin that look like little tiny bursts or blings. Those are just kind of rotating all around, and they're kind of moving like counterclockwise or clockwise all around that person's body as a silhouette. And then every once in a while, there's a little star pattern in there and things like that. So that's kind of what I've started with. This is a living thing. That's what you can tell so far. If you want any more in-depth information, you have to actually roll higher. So that's kind of what I did. That's how I describe astral space. How do you describe
That's not bad. I generally picture astral space as... And sort of like if I'm trying to, and I don't actually do it that often in terms of like, oh, here's the blah, blah. But it's kind of like if you've ever been out in the wilderness at night, away from cities, away from 20th century, 21st century light pollution and all that sort of thing, that astral space kind of feels like sun's gone down, very late twilight.
Not a lot of moon.
Not a lot of moon. Like if there were nothing around in astral space, if there were no living patterns around nearby.
Oh, yeah, fair.
It would be dark. It would be black. You would not be able to see anything.
Yeah.
But there is a glow if you're on Earth, if you're in Barsave. There is a glow, like everything is kind of lit by the living pattern of the Earth itself. Will then kind of sort of reflect off of the imprints of things around it. And that maybe kind of gives them a little bit of their definition. But any that are magical, are living, are lights in their own sense. So it's if you've ever been on stage.
Oh, yeah.
Done a stage production, a stage play in the theater or whatever, or you've been up, like on stage in a concert or anything where you've got all the lights in your face. You can see all the lights, but you can't make out much. Like you can maybe see the outlines of people in the audience and whatnot.
Yeah.
That's maybe another thing that you can kind of look at, because astral space itself, except in unusual circumstances, is going to be lit by the very things. It's kind of okay.
It's not really, I didn't mean it as a stump question, but I figured...
No, this is not, I'm trying to think of a good way to do this. Okay. Our regular world.
Yes.
We can see what we are seeing because photons are coming from somewhere, whether that be the sun or a light bulb or whatever. They are coming out of that thing and bouncing off and hitting our eyes. Okay. In astral space, what is happening is that the things that we can see are generating their own light.
Yeah.
It seems kind of cliche, but think of like the stereotypical Hollywood, like infrared vision kind of things.
I'm going to go with Predator, because that's where I usually use
Predator.
That. So when he switches on his infrared, most of the jungle turns out into like I said, a couple shades of blue. They're all the same temperature.
Right.
And then that living thing he's looking at is solidified into the hot zones and cold zones, whatever the case may be. So I use that background image for my astral space.
But except instead of temperature gradients, it's magic gradients.
Exactly.
That's what I'm saying. It's like Astral Sight takes this information that we do not normally have senses to perceive and translates it into a way that we can. In the same way that a thermal camera or a low light camera.
Yes.
Actually, if you think of more traditional like night vision cameras.
Yeah.
Like we couldn't normally see, but we have the camera that has the sensors that can pick up and translate that.
Yes.
That thermal energy, or can amplify the really low levels of photons that are available to make it visible to our weak human eyes.
Yes.
Again, those are all like metaphors and similes and whatnot, but those are the kinds of things that we're working with here.
The back of the original book, the original Earthdawn book, there's two pictures. One is of somebody reaching their arm into the sky, and the other is like a photo negative.
Right.
Of that
that's
picture.
It's in the interior as well. The back is
Well, the back's in color, so that's why I'm using this one, because the reverse of that, the photo negative of that, is kind of how I've also looked at astral space. It's not very color oriented, but it's brightness oriented.
Except you can use, like, I imagine that Astral Sight might translate certain things into colors as our brains sort of understand them.
Yeah, I usually do like a white or a gold silhouette or yellow silhouette, and then occasionally red for evil and things like that. So
I am hesitant to get deeply into it because I don't know enough about it and I don't have any personal experience with it.
Fair.
But it might be interesting to look at the narratives at people who have synesthesia.
Oh.
Talk about in terms of their experiences with numbers having sounds or colors or whatever, where there's a processing thing that happens in their brains that connects other sensations with certain things. And that might be, like, again, I have not looked into it too deeply, but it's a fascinating notion, and it might be something to take a little bit of inspiration from.
If anybody wants to read something about that, the autism savant Daniel Tammet wrote a book called Born on a Blue Day, and that talks a lot about that. And it's fascinating that he has certain numbers that just feel blue to him, and certain numbers that are fuzzy, and certain numbers that just come in red and angry and so forth. And so, yeah, that's kind of it as well. But
like you could use that maybe as a not saying, oh, astral sensing is like having synesthesia. No, that is not what I am saying at all.
But
what I'm saying is that maybe if you look at the descriptions and the narratives of people who experience this phenomenon, and maybe present ways for you to find different ways of presenting information and sensory inputs.
Yeah, absolutely. So
because again, when it comes to magic, we're dealing with a fictional energy. We're dealing with a fictional
interpretation of it,
fictional senses and interpretations of it. So there's not really any wrong way, as long as you are consistent in how you want to handle that in your game.
Yeah. So we have 2 more questions.
We do. We've got one from Lee. Just a couple of basic things regarding astral insight questions. 1, does astral sight give insight into a person's emotional state? No, I would say probably not, because that's something that would be the area of a talent like emotion sense, or that's not the name of it.
I've blanked on everything in this exact minute.
Scrolling through the talent list.
Empathic sense. Thank you.
Empathic sense. Yeah, there is a specific talent that is about emotional state. Empathic sense.
Yeah.
Astral sight should not, I don't think, on its own normally give much insight into that.
I agree. Astral sight, like I said, is reading the magical energy, and that's less transitory than their emotional state, which can fluctuate wildly from minute to minute, hour to hour.
Question 2, does it still work even if the user has lost normal use of their eyes? Yes, we've already answered that, as the wording seems to suggest that it's a 360 detection field rather than a visual cone. That bit of things, it's not... I still tend to, when we're talking about astral sight and people using it, they will still tend to focus on their eyes because the information is being translated most frequently into visual cues, and so we'll go along with that. Also, if it were a 360 detection field on its own, the astral sense wizard spell wouldn't be as useful as it is, because all it does at that point is extend the duration and do strain.
Yeah.
So, but yes, absolutely, somebody who is visually impaired can absolutely use astral sight to navigate the world.
Yeah.
3, is the mythical plane of Ale actually real? The scholars are still debating that one.
I am not going to weigh in on
so thank you, Lee.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we had sort of already answered one of those, but okay. Finally, from Shane, I have a question about astral sight, and by extension, astral space in general.
Here we go.
Across Earthdawn and Shadowrun, there are a number of conflicting views on what astral space looks like, with inconsistent art.
What?
Of course. In Earthdawn, what do astral space, astral entities, astral patterns, etc. look like? Some visual touchstones would really be useful.
Oh, cool.
Perhaps in an upcoming magic book, a good chunk of the art space could be dedicated to a consistent, within the boundaries of the fact magic is inconsistent in some ways, view of what astral space looks like. So we already covered
part of it,
a couple of these things. If you haven't there is not an ebook version of it available currently, but the novel Prophecy by Greg Gordon has a lot of sections where the main character, Kimrick, who is a wizard,
goes through what things look astrally speaking.
Is examining things astrally.
Oh, all the time.
And that has informed a lot of my feelings on astral perception and sensing, and I suspect...
And... as I say, Greg Gordon is not just the novelist that was hired. He was actually one of the game designers.
Yeah, he was actually one of the
developers
game
of the Magic system. So if you want it straight from the horse's mouth, per se, we already called Morgan once. But I remember specifically a passage in that where the wizard is looking at a hillside, and there's a horror lying underneath the ground in the hillside. And so he can see the tentacles split out like an octopus and so forth and so on. And so he's going through like a page and a half of description of what this thing looks like, astrally speaking. So if you want that, and I agree with you, art is art, and a single art direction
is art. We've talked a little bit about what sort of our impression of astral space in general looks like. And again, because we're to like get back to the Astral Sight and the related astral sensing talents are converting information into a way that the Namegiver can comprehend.
Yeah.
And it might even be a little bit different for each individual.
Yeah.
In a sense, right? That's certainly possible. But obviously, as a GM, you probably want to be consistent in terms of your presentation of stuff. But think of like graphic design type stuff, like are the threads, are the bits of magical energy, are they sharp jagged lines, are they curves, are they elaborate knots, are they like a string of pearls with different colored or maybe different shaped things, fractal designs. Like I think it'd be really cool to maybe conceive of astral perception and examining a pattern as looking at a fractal.
Yeah.
You get it, and you kind of get this initial outline, and as you zoom in, those bits expand out and maybe provide more detail and
totally
that kind of thing. But also not just color, shape, texture, however you want to convey the information that astral perception, like that astral sense is going to provide to the individual.
I posted something. There was a picture recently of a tree that happened to go through a forest fire, and it exposed some of the inner workings of the tree itself. And
somebody shared that picture on the Earthdawn Guild.
That was me.
Oh, that was you?
That was me.
Okay.
And I said,
I
this
didn't
is what
notice
I
who
think
did it.
trees look like astrally. And it's just
the trees in the Bloodwood.
Bloodwood especially. But I think the same, I've applied that same thing to what my characters that I'm running have seen astrally speaking as well. So there's always these threads and this tapestry and this woven net mesh thing going on. And when they've looked astrally, there's these high points like gaps in the net for what might be corruption or just an incomplete part of their pattern or something along those lines. Or sometimes it's been many silhouettes. And so you have that one big silhouette on the entire body and then smaller silhouettes as they gradiate in toward the heart of the person. And so that's kind of a pattern as well. All these interconnecting things. So
I'm suddenly thinking of cheesy 70s sci-fi effects.
Yeah. So that's it's my animation brain kicking in sometimes to make a cartoon out of the whole thing. But that's how I've kind of conveyed some of those patterns. What I'm going to start doing, and what I should have been doing all along, is actually assign a color to each one of the Namegiver races, because I've always imagined windlings as like a yellow pattern, and dwarves is kind of like a blue, earthy pattern, and elves is greenish to go along with the woods, and so forth. And cinnamon has always been gray or rock-like, something like that, or red for, sandstone, because I live near red rocks. But just something along those lines is I should start assigning a color to each one of those patterns for a Namegiver, per se. But that's just a thought. I haven't done it yet, but I should, so.
Yeah. So I hope we're now here cutting out Morgan's there. We're
5
probably
minutes in the middle
a little bit under an hour. Yeah. But we've had some great questions that spawned some general discussion and some more specific addressing of things. Yeah. And I think to perhaps sum up, that probably like the basic point, the starting point is to go back to how I view and what I perceive the purpose of astral space within the framework of the Earthdawn game to be. And that is to either help provide atmosphere and mood to an area, or to be a way of conveying information that the wizard or nethermancer or whoever is examining something astrally is trying to gain. And then basically like you start from there, the same way that you would set the mood or the style of the group entering when they go into a tavern. Is it a warm, friendly, homey environment? Is it the kind of place where everybody's kind of like hunched over their drinks and it's like quiet, and the troubadour in the corner is maybe trying to play some music, but it's not that he's bad, but just the general, like nobody's feeling like that's a very different sense. The kind of like rough and tumble frontier feeling that you would get entering Haven is very different than the feeling that you would get crossing the threshold of the gates into the Grand Bazaar of Thrall.
Yeah.
Those are very different environments and have very different feels. And in the same way that you would do that with the regular experience, if somebody is looking at something astrally, they are going to have very different astral experiences as well. And you can just use that to enhance those moods or themes or whatever.
Yeah.
And having your wizard in the party go, well, I'm going to detect astral, like I'm going to sense astrally, and they roll, and your answer is, the only thing you see is a whole bunch of astral pollution. That right there is going to immediately
elicit a response.
That's going to convey information and elicit a response and immediately kind of set a tone without any, even without getting into any more detail.
Yeah, it's going to change your whole strategy right there.
But even if they succeed in the roll, you perceive astral, you manage to get through to pierce the veil and perceive astral space, but you can see a lot of little clumps of twisted dark knots that are floating through the air and occasionally drift and partially block your vision as it's kind of, this area is tainted. I think I used that, not that exact description, but a very similar kind of thing. If you go back and listen to the Crit Show one shot that I ran, where the spellcaster, I'm going to look astrally, and looked astrally and went, oh crap. This just confirms what we kind of suspected was going on, and that sort of situation.
My thought on astral corruption has always been it looks like what used to be a channel tuned to zero, or to snow from what William Gibson put out in Neuromancer. So it also looks like black and white snow. So I was and I can't do that anymore because those channels don't exist. Yes. So I can't use that anymore because digital. Anyway,
but white noise.
That's my impression of what astral interference looks like. But other than that, folks, we'll leave you. I'm sure
somebody put up a little YouTube video of
snow
static.
I always love that.
Of TV snow.
I used to do cable TV troubleshooting before it all went digital, so I still remember what that stuff looks like. So black and white snow, one of my favorite things. The noise. Yeah, love that.
I hope this was helpful.
I believe it was. We at least answered some direct questions.
I know that we addressed some specific questions. We talked generalities. We're now kind of circling back around to where we were 5 minutes ago.
We do that.
But no, that's fine. I hope this was helpful. If you have any other questions, anything that you want clarified, any follow-ups to this, by all means,
or give us your impression of astral space. If you have a better version than what we have that we like, send it in. We'd love to hear what your impressions of astral space look like when people are sensing it, inhabiting it, or what you imagine an astral imprint looks like as well. We'd love to have that because I've fumbled for years and I think I've finally coalesced into a unified vision of what one should maybe look like when people are sensing it. But if you got something better, I'd love to hear it. I'm pretty sure Josh would as well.
Sure. You can send those to us, edsgpodcast@gmail.com. If you have questions about anything else, feel free to send those in as well. But I think that will thank you to Morgan for answering his phone this evening to get the clarification on that one answer.
Shout out to Morgan.
Certainly appreciate it.
Does not get enough credit on the podcast.
That wraps us up here for tonight.
Yes. So
not quite sure what our next big deep dive thing will be, but I think for the big ones, letting people know ahead of time.
Yeah.
Might work out pretty well.
It's always fun to hear. Absolutely. So until next time, folks, it is time for you to go sense your own legend. Astrally.
Good night, everybody.